Can you hear me?
How's it going, Justin?
Yeah, how's it going, man?
Good, good. You're in a different spot.
Yeah, yeah.
So was that like your studio last time, or?
Yeah, it is. And now I'm just at my house.
Cool. Cool. Well, I invited a couple other people to come be flies on the wall, but we don't necessarily have to wait for anybody. Are you expecting anyone else to join from your side, or? Okay. All right. Well, shall we just dive in?
Yeah,
All
absolutely.
right. Cool. So I already clicked record, so we're rolling.
Okay, great.
So I guess to kind of transition from our last convo, so you had kind of invited me to come up with my own theory. And so I gave it some thought. I had some other personal things that prevented us from getting back together quicker than now, but hey, it's only been 3 weeks, so you had more
Before
time
we
than
get
that.
into that, which I'm excited to hear, do you mind if I ask you a couple other questions?
Sure.
Okay. So first of all, I was wondering what the response has been to you of the previous recording, or even the two previous recordings. Like, just
Um,
didn't hear anything back from anybody, or
I basically I didn't upload it. My kids got sick that weekend after, and then I didn't realize you had uploaded it, but I was like, all right, it's already up there. Kim's actually the one that noticed that it was first uploaded, and so she sent me the link. She's like, hey, did you see this was on YouTube? I was like, oh, I hadn't even noticed, but
yeah.
so I heard from Kim on it.
Have we not agreed to upload it? Did I do that?
Oh, no, you're good. Like I was intending to do it too. I just hadn't gotten around to it. So
Okay.
no,
Yeah,
you're totally
so
good.
where I uploaded it, I kind of assumed it would be, people that I know and their feedback and whatnot. So I was wondering on your end. But if you
Yeah.
I guess that makes sense. So.
Yeah, so it hasn't been uploaded on my end, but another friend of mine, I think you may have like bumped into him on Facebook or something. His name's Jacob Vidrine, and he had come across it on Facebook or something, and he texted me.
I've been saying that wrong. Dang.
Vidrine, yeah, Jacob Vidrine.
Yeah, he's great. I think he's a
Yeah,
researcher. He's awesome.
he's a pretty good historian there. So he actually went to high school with my little brothers, so we're from the same hometown.
Interesting. Yeah, is
Yeah.
he the actual trained historian? I didn't know that. I thought that was his thing to research everything as much as he
I
could.
don't think he like went to college or anything like that. He's not like credentialed or whatever you want to say, but he was trained as a researcher
Yeah.
by a historian
Okay, cool.
um, named
Yeah, I
David
asked
Collier
him
and
to be
stuff.
in
So.
part two if he wanted to be in it, but he hasn't got back yet.
Oh, okay.
To say whatever he, to represent his side of things, because he's very well studied. So
Yeah,
I'd love to hear from him.
for sure, for sure. Cool. Any other questions?
Yeah. Okay. So I was wondering a little bit about your background as far as what you studied for this particular topic.
Yeah.
So you sound, well versed compared to an average person in your history and whatnot. But I'm wondering specifically for the 2 to 3 minutes in the jail that I concentrated on in the movie. What did you do to study and understand the different accounts and what was going on there?
Yeah, so obviously I read the eyewitness accounts. I've reviewed from a legal perspective. I've reviewed the famous trials article that you brought up last time. I had actually done that about a month or so ago, maybe more. Time flies. I've been to Carthage. When I was there, I was with a gentleman by the name of Calvin Stevens. He's actually a family friend, but he's been a CES employee for many years. And so he was my grandma's mission president, kind of been friends of the family. We're from the same Morgan Valley. And so when he was there, he was able to clarify and correct some of the things that was said by the missionaries, like the tour guides that are assigned there. because they're service missionaries. They're not actually historians themselves. They're just kind of following the script, and
Yeah.
they do the best they can. But I really valued Calvin Stevens. I've also spoken just briefly with Richard Holtzapfel in the past, who is a pretty well-known historian. But yeah, I skimmed back through some of the Lyon Brothers stuff. From a firearms perspective, I actually studied. Well, I'll present some of those things that I came across while I'm going through presenting my theory and that. So,
do you feel, where does the representatives at Carthage get their script from? Do you have any idea?
I mean, I would presume from the local mission president, who probably gets it from the correlation department. I mean, I don't know first from
Kimberly has
knowledge.
argued quite often against my assertion that the church has changed their narrative. And the evidence that I offer for that is the main one is the Saints book. It's John Taylor's Watch story. They've actually changed that online. So that's a change in the narrative. And I would assume if it's on their website that that's an official change. And then B, which is a little more subtle, is the Saints book. And in the Saints book, they write Hiram, instead of being 10 feet back from the door, like both eyewitnesses say, he's at the door when he gets shot. So how definitive is the Saints book? And I'm like, I don't know. They published it, I thought. And
I mean, I think that it's pretty, like, I'm not going to say the church hasn't changed the narrative. I mean, and it's natural, like things can evolve over the years. I kind of think it was a mistake for the church to ever depart from the eyewitness accounts. But that's just my opinion. Maybe they had other better reasons that we just are not privy to.
Okay, so we agree that they've changed it. Again, when I went to Carthage, the official script there was, hey, if you have questions, read the Saints book. So that's why I took it as that was their position. But
Yeah.
I'm like, if they went rogue and said that on their own, then that would not be the church.
Well,
position.
and I think we have this cultural bias where we presume that if it's printed in a church manual, it is the church's official position or whatnot,
Right.
like the official doctrine. But the fact of the matter is, like, manuals have evolved over the years, like they're and not necessarily to like contradict or teach radically different theology or doctrines. I mean, there are some examples of that, but I think a lot of times it's just different emphasis, different, the church kind of mirrors some of the other zeitgeists in the world, if you will.
So I wasn't trying to accuse the church of anything by saying that they changed their narrative, as much as bringing up, look, even the church acknowledges this new evidence that's come forth has been difficult to fit with the eyewitness accounts. So they're trying to make that work. That's what I was trying to acknowledge is, look, it's not just these crazy nuts like me trying to figure out a theory. Even the church is trying to figure out their theory about what happened.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, but the church has been duped before. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with Mark Hoffman. So it's like, so there's a difference between, I guess you could say, revelation or inspiration versus scholarship. And, scholars can easily be deceived. Not saying that people that get revelation can't ever get deceived. I mean, Joseph was deceived and he admitted it, and it's in the Revelations, like repent, and he acknowledged those types of things. I don't judge or condemn a person or whatever for evolving their perspective with what they think is
totally
new information. So
like
I don't think it's that big of a deal. I think that it was a mistake, and I hope that maybe as a result of our conversation tonight, maybe the church will officially get back to the eyewitness account, or something closer to the original eyewitness accounts. I don't know.
You think they'll watch this?
I doubt it. I'm not holding my breath. But if we can get the ideas out.
You, it's interesting that you're willing to talk to me, because that's a risky move. Consider what the church thinks about me. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that it's been pretty clear that we disagree fundamentally about a lot of stuff. So I'm really not. And the other thing is, like, I think that truth is really important. And so if I have an opportunity to stand for what I feel is true and right, then, I'm not going to back down from that. So,
You and I am not a pit digger either. You say something today and then change it tomorrow. I'm like, good for you. Yeah, keep going for the truth. I totally agree. But you mentioned in our last discussion that you don't agree with everything the church did. Is that kind of what you're talking about, or is there something else
uh,
along those lines?
say like, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to.
Well, you started off your conversation with Justin and Kimberly saying, or both you and Justin were like, look, I'm not perfect. I don't believe everything the church believes, but there are certain things that I do support and whatnot.
Oh, for sure.
And then last time we kind of said that, but we didn't dive into that because again, I didn't ask questions. So I don't know if that's too personal or not, but I was just wondering what does that mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I basically sustain the church in as much as I can, and in as much as they fulfill their mission. I mean, as when they're bringing souls to Christ, and when they're administering the ordinances of baptism, and helping people build faith and repent, and I mean, I 100% sustain that. And the the challenges that I see are, some of the cultural influences that come into the church. And so I have concerns about, like, well, in the scriptures, we have a lot of precedents of, in the Old Testament, well, the government says jump and Daniel said no. And or Elijah totally went against the political authorities of his day. Jesus himself, I mean, he was accused of being a rabble rouser. He paid his taxes, like, but he did it in a very unorthodox way. Anyway, but so we know that we can't serve both God and mammon. And so, I have concerns with some of the directions of the church when it comes to like political pressure. And that goes back to the old days. I mean, the original days, not just in modern times. Because for me, I feel like if it's a true principle, we should do it anyway, regardless of what kind of pressure or political consequences may follow. I mean, there's the hymn, do what is right, let the consequence follow. But I'm not casting stones or, judging any individuals. I'm just expressing my concern on what I perceive to be departures from principles. And my encouragement would be for anybody in the church or anybody in the world to learn the true principles, govern ourselves, and answer to God.
So when they make a move it appears like they're trying to go along with the world to appease the world or something like that, the way that I hear many members reconcile that is no, they're just getting along with Babylon so that they can be a better influence on Babylon or some of that. What do you think of that?
I don't really see that as being, uh, a principled approach to how of response to that situation. But I understand it's hard. Like, it's hard to be a super minority. It's hard to go against the grain. And like, I'm not going to sit here and judge anybody that struggles and succumbs to those pressures and temptations, uh, because it's hard to be the outcast. It's hard to go against the grain that way.
Right.
Um, but anyway,
So when are you an active member of the church?
I attend meetings as regularly as I feel inspired to, but I don't go every Sunday now.
So if they say raise your hand to sustain, do you just say, well, I sustain certain parts and not, or how do you?
You know,
Yeah.
uh, that's something that I've had plenty of conversations with priesthood, leaders, bishops, and stuff, and we're good. Like, I don't have any animosity towards the bishop, and he doesn't have any animosity towards me. Like, we're actually live across the street from each other. We're good neighbors. Um, we've, I guess, amicably agreed to disagree on certain perspectives and live and let live, man. Like,
I wish I had your bishop. That's cool that he's okay with you live and let live. So
yeah, well, and like, I think if I was to come out and like start to be critical, openly critical of people, like individuals,
right.
and publish things, I'm sure that the nature of that relationship would change. But as it is, like I say, I'm just here to be a good neighbor, to contribute to the ward, in as much as I'm, feel inspired to, and as much as people need and want me to be involved.
So when you
So
say feel inspired, meaning being directed by the Spirit, right?
mhm, mhm.
So if the Spirit tells you to do something that is contradictory to something that the church or even President Nelson says, what's the trump in your mind? And there, you can't do both. Which one would you choose to do?
I mean, it's difficult because I think those would be handled more case by case.
Okay,
It's hard to kind of,
the prophet says you need to go to church every Sunday, and the Spirit's telling you, no, I'll tell you which days to go. Which would you follow?
well, the good question. The church invites people to attend meetings regularly, and there are, certain things that are conditional upon meeting those attendance requirements and stuff. And so I just look at it as cause and effect. If I want to have the consequences of that follow regular church attendance, then I'll attend church regularly. And if that's what the Lord inspires me to do, great. If
Okay,
if
you're not answering my question, and I feel like maybe I'm backing you into a corner, which I don't mean to do. Which trumps, the inspiration or President Nelson, if they contradict it?
if they contradict, I account to God for my actions, and so
Okay,
I will follow the dictates of my conscience.
which that's the way I approach it as well. Understanding the risks of that I may be getting deceived in my inspiration. But what do you think the church's position on that? How would they answer that?
Well, again, I think it depends. Like, so it's handled case by case, and hopefully the leadership people involved in those types of decisions are inspired by God. Uh, I think that they're also men and may have made mistakes. It's over the so I think that people that have been, disfellowshipped or excommunicated from the church, sometimes it was the right decision and it was God's will for that to happen. I think other times the leaders were doing the best they could, but maybe made a mistake. I mean, we know that in Joseph's day, the Nauvoo High Council brought up Pelatia or Pelatiah Brown. I don't know how you pronounce his name. And they were going to try him for his membership. And, Joseph stood up in a conference that Sunday and he preached the sermon, and he was talking about, hey, I don't like this. I don't like a church that requires me to, accept their creed. That sounds too much more like the Methodists. I
Right.
love the freedom and the liberty to believe as I feel. And
Right.
it feels so good not to be trammeled. And so, I feel like any individuals that may make a mistake and maybe excommunicate a person unjustly, or even though it wasn't God's will, hopefully they can repent. Hopefully they can make amends, and hopefully they can recognize that it was a mistake. Uh, but I'm not going to like condemn them either, because I'm sure they did what they thought was the right thing. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it.
I think what I'm hearing from you is the president of the church is not infallible. Is that your correct belief?
Yeah, I think that the scriptures are pretty clear that, you know, there are principles, and then there are traditions. And we oftentimes conflate, and we think that something is a principle just because it's become a tradition. Um, but I mean, Joseph was Joseph was probably as close as we got to a just man made perfect, in this dispensation.
Mhm.
Maybe there's been others, but maybe I think he's at least the most prominent person that got the furthest in that
Yeah.
endeavor.
Right.
And but like Joseph made mistakes, and he was chastised. I mean, there's all sorts of revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants where he was chastened for this or that, or mistakes. And to me, the most amazing thing about Joseph is he just took it, man. I mean, he did not take offense. He didn't renounce or rebel against God in response to those. He set a great example for all of us to aspire to follow, of, if the Lord rebukes, get our egos out of the way.
Right.
And And I believe that because he was humble and submissive, despite his flaws, despite his mistakes over his lifetime, uh, he never fell from grace. Like God always upheld him, and you know, he had amazing gifts. And anyway, so does that answer your question?
Yeah. Do you believe the Book of Mormon is the Word of God?
I do.
What principles did Joseph teach that the church is not teaching today, in your view?
Uh, there's a lot. I mean, the church in Joseph's day was all about gathering to Zion, and now it's more like, stay where you are. And you know, I have my personal belief that, you know, it's important to gather to Zion, but I don't think the church says you can't move. I think they're just saying it's not a requirement of the church. So I don't actually, so yeah, that's a great example of a teaching that in Joseph's day and Brigham's and John Taylor's times, that was very emphasized, like move, move to Nauvoo, or Palmyra, Kirtland, Nauvoo, and then eventually Salt Lake. And in the last century, that's been very much de-emphasized. And
Is Zion on the earth today, in your view?
I think the work of the Father, which would be like building Zion, establishing his kingdom on the earth, uh, I don't think it's quite time. I think we're getting close, but I don't think we're quite there yet. I don't think we're ready
Do
as
you
a
think
people.
that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the Lord's true church on the earth?
Yeah.
Do you think that they, when they started, had Zion?
No, I think many are called, but few are chosen. Why are they not chosen? Because they cover their sins, aspire to the honors of men. They, all of those things Section 121 talks about.
So you don't believe that they achieved Zion? Do you believe that they laid did Joseph lay the foundation for Zion?
100%.
And what
Yeah.
does that mean?
Well, he restored the priesthood. And I believe that he did not fail. The restoration didn't fail. I think that he was the prophet of the restoration. And what did he restore? The priesthood, which is the authority to act in God's name, to administer in the name of God. He restored the keys, which is knowing how to administer ordinances, knowing, how to commune with heaven, knowing how to get answers to our prayers. All of those keys were restored by Joseph. And the door was, I'm not going to say the door was open. The map, the roadmap was revealed, and it's up to each of us individually to follow that map to wherever it leads and to arrive at that Zion society. And I hope that I can be on that path and reach that destination before I die.
Do you
But
think the church today is closer to Zion than when Joseph was alive, or further, or the same?
I think that when you look at a collective body of people, it's very difficult
Right.
to make collective judgment. I think there's individuals alive today that are just as close as a lot of individuals were in the time of Joseph, but I think that as a body, we're probably about the same. I mean, maybe we've regressed, maybe in some ways, but like, the Section 84 talked about how the church is under condemnation for forgetting the new covenant and the Book of Mormon. And Ezra Taft Benson reiterated that, and I think that either the 60s or the 80s, I can't remember if it was when he was an apostle or when he had become the president. He's like,
He's the prophet. Yeah.
okay, so so he reiterated that, and he's like, this is just as applicable to us today as it was back in the time that it was originally revealed. So if that's an indication, yeah, I'd say we still have a lot of work to do.
And what do
But
you think is the biggest failure? It has been almost 200 years, and we're not much closer. And some would argue we're further away than when Joseph was alive. Why? What happened? What?
well,
Thing?
so yeah,
Talk
I
about
mean,
it.
I think it's a fair question, but I think that the
Is it
true
just
answer,
timing? It's not the members, it's just timing, and when timing hits, it'll, or is it
I mean,
we
Section 88 does make it very clear that we cannot dictate to God what his time and plan is. We it's according to his will and his plan and his timing. So section 88, like verse 65 to 70, somewhere around there. And so like I would not say that the church has failed in its mission. I think that people today have every bit as much opportunity as the people in Joseph's day to progress, to develop spiritually, to reach the heavens. And we may have a propensity, like we live in a very collectivistic society. We think in groups, we think in terms of collectivism. And so we want to put the finger at the church as being at fault for the saints not being where they should be. To me, I think that a healthier and more accurate place to point the finger is right here, right at me and myself. And if we can take individual and personal responsibility for our spiritual progression and our relationship with the Lord. And the church does not say you can't do that. It's not like the church is preventing people from approaching God. It's just we need to do better individually. And that is something that I don't look to the church to necessarily fix.
I agree with that. It's your responsibility. It's not the church's responsibility.
Yeah.
But to counter my own thought on that is Melchizedek. Melchizedek started off with a bunch of sinful reprobates and was able to turn them into a Zion society. So I'm like, so there's something about whatever Melchizedek did. I mean, he was one of the greatest leaders ever, the Prince of Peace. There's something, so I'm like, it's probably better to say it's both than it's just all on the members. I don't know.
I would definitely say that good guides are really important.
Like Joseph, if he had been allowed to live longer and he wasn't being constantly pestered with lawsuits and all the stuff holding him back, I mean, don't you think he could have? I mean, if he had gone west and handpicked the people to go, I think he could have done it. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's a
Yeah,
tragedy.
I mean,
that
Enoch had what, 350 years to work out his Zion?
Well, so by that standard, we were only 200 in. So maybe in the next 150 years
right.
we'll get there, right?
But the interesting thing about the 200 years is how long were the Nephites and Lamanites in Bountiful in before they started getting corrupted?
Well, so like post Christ's visit, post the cataclysm.
Yeah.
I mean, it was.
When did the first guy say, I'm going to wear a fancier suit than that guy? It was about 200 years.
Yeah.
When that fell apart, which is
and those types of individual choices can infect the collective mindset, but just like evil corrupting influences can enter, so can good. And so I think that's really the key, is if we take personal responsibility and just walk the walk, that to me is going to speak volumes more than just, preaching from the pulpit. I mean, not that I mind preaching from the pulpit, but
my personal message, if I was to have a religious personal message, the thing that my family and friends are sick of hearing from me is go to God yourself. Seek answers from him yourself. You don't need a mediator to say, here's what that means, or here, they can give you ideas about how to do it. But at the end of the day, you got to go and get your answers. What does the scripture mean? What am I supposed to do in my life? How do I follow the commandments specifically to me? That's the thing I just pound on again and again and again. And people get so upset about it because it's dismissing servants, called servants. And I'm like, I understand that point, but.
Well, and many are called. It's not that there's a lack of people called. It's just, again, we are called. We're called. Like, and so I look at myself, and I've been called. I've been ordained to the priesthood. I have a calling from God, a commission, you could say. And so I will answer to him for how I handle that calling. And I can't say, well, my bishop didn't tell me to do that, or the prophet didn't tell me to do that, or the brethren in general conference didn't tell me to, and have that be an excuse. Because if the Lord prompts us to do certain things, that's on us. Right. And 1 Kings 13, man. I mean, even if a true prophet tells us to do something, we're supposed to follow God. I mean, are you familiar with that story from
with with the two prophets that disagreed? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, so there was the prophet that was called by God to go and declare a message to the king, and then he does it. And then on his way back, he meets a senior prophet, and the senior prophet's like, "Hey, come on in, have some dinner. Why don't you relax?" And the God though had told him to go straight home, and stay fasting. Well, he deferred to the senior prophet, and the next day he was eaten by the lion. So I guess that's just to me a dramatic representation of the principle, which is
I'm having a hard time figuring out how do we agree on so much of this stuff so far. It must be the principles that we disagree on. What's your stance on polygamy?
it's a true principle. It's an eternal principle.
And we should be living it right now or no?
Well, it's interesting. John Taylor received a revelation in 1886. So between the time of Joseph's, Nauvoo period and 1885, the church had kind of been, I guess you could say, regulating a lot of the plural marriages that were happening. And I think that there was a lot of good reasons for that. I don't think it was the ideal situation, and because it introduces opportunity for unrighteous dominion, for corruption, whatever. But nevertheless, it did a lot of good, and so I'm not going to sit here and judge anybody for those decisions that were
In
made.
our world today in Utah, where it's legal again, should the church be bringing it back right now?
That's between them and the Lord. But in 1886, John Taylor received a revelation, and it said that it is more pleasing to me, God speaking, thus saith the Lord to my servant John, that people should use their individual agency in these matters. And so, to me, if an individual is called by God to live that principle, he or she should do it. And sadly, like in Joseph's day, he said, "I'm going to have to excommunicate you if you get caught doing this." There's records of him saying that to various people, uh, which ironically, because he was the one that was teaching them this principle, but it was in private, because it was not yet time for that to be publicly accepted by the church. Now, I have no insight. I'm not here to speculate what the church is or isn't going to do in regard to their position on polygamy and the modern practice of it. I don't expect it. But if I meet people that are living that principle, I'm not going to like cast stones at them or anything. I'm not going to judge them, because I believe that 1886 revelation, which is that it is more pleasing to God for individuals to use their own personal agency in those matters.
What's your stance on the Adam God doctrine?
I don't claim to understand it perfectly, but I believe there's truth to it for sure. And I think it came from Joseph. Like Brigham never claimed that it was his original doctrines. He always attributed it to Joseph. It was stuff that Joseph had taught him. I don't know that Brigham necessarily had the clearest understanding. I think he had a lot of insight because he was privileged to learn it directly from Joseph's mouth. But yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to those principles.
What's your stance on the doctrine of blood atonement?
There is, so the doctrine of blood atonement is not something that I necessarily oppose from a scriptural perspective. Like in the Old Testament, there's a lot of, thus saith the Lord, do these things, which involve execution of criminals and for various penalties and so forth. And so I also believe that when you shed innocent blood, which has been equated with denying the Holy Ghost, that there is not forgiveness in this life for those types of things. So to me, like, I would definitely defer to civil magistrates. I would not be comfortable personally administering that penalty. But I think there's truth. I mean, basically, do you believe in the death penalty? And my answer is yes. When certain crimes against society, against humanity are committed, the appropriate penalty in that situation is death.
Do you think that Brigham Young administered any blood atonements for people that broke the church's laws?
I've heard speculation of those types of things. I don't think there's any like hard evidence of it. Not that I've seen
What's
anyway.
your thoughts?
My thoughts are, if he did, I sure hope that it was because God inspired him to. But I don't think that he ever did in a, in a literal fashion.
Okay. And what's your thoughts about blacks in the priesthood?
Blacks in the priesthood, there's a lot of stuff. So scripturally speaking, there's Abraham chapter 1, which could support the idea that blacks shouldn't be given the priesthood or whatnot. But yet in the Book of Mormon, it says that God is no respecter of persons, and it doesn't matter your race if you come to God with humility and humble heart. And so, I mean, there's all sorts of precedents where God has issued commandments for a purpose, and they were temporary. They were not eternal principles. I do not believe it's an eternal principle for people of the black race to be deprived of priesthood. I think that if the Lord wanted to try their faith for a time, it's well within scriptural and historical precedent for him to issue a temporary ban of certain things. However, I think that it's important to study some into the context. So Elijah Abel was ordained in Joseph Smith's lifetime, and so were a couple of other gentlemen. I'm Walker Lewis, I think was the gentleman's name, up in New England area, Boston, Massachusetts, or something.
Did you
And
watch
these
that
were
movie Green Flake about him also?
no,
It's
I
a
haven't. No,
anyway.
but so like there is historical record that Joseph administered, gave priesthood to certain black men in his lifetime,
So
or maybe not personally, but
was
under his
Brigham
personal
wrong when he
direction.
said all of the seed of Cain are cursed and cannot have the priesthood and will be in
Well,
a lower place in the kingdom of heaven than everybody else?
he never quite said that. I'm familiar with the quote, but so yeah, I'll kind of restate it as I recall it, which is important to get that accurate. But so the context is really important. So what happened is, Elijah Abel, Walker Lewis were these upstanding, stalwart men of God, saints in the midst of the saints in those days, but yet the church, there were a lot of people from all sorts of backgrounds. And so there were people in the church, not Joseph, I don't believe, but other people in the church who were like racist. Let's just call it what it is. They were prejudiced against the men. In fact, the gentleman, his name is escaping me just in the moment, but the actual gentleman who administered the Melchizedek priesthood to Elijah Abel, um, uh, it's an L. It's on the tip of my tongue. Levi? No, not. Anyway, but so the guy that did that, he administered the priesthood to Elijah Abel under Joseph Smith's direction. In a much later recollection, 30, 40 years later, he testified that he was very uncomfortable in doing that and didn't want to do that and thought it was wrong. And he only did it because Joseph explicitly asked, and so he deferred to Joseph and administered that. And that was given as evidence, in the 1880s, when people were like, hey, is this really the thing to do? Is this really the ban? And so they came forth to, and so like Leonard L. John Nuttall took down the testimony from this gentleman. I'm going to kick myself all night after I think of his name, because anyway, but so going back to right after the martyrdom, the saints are in Nauvoo for that 1.5 to 2 year period. There was a black brother who was a convert to the church. He came and was joining with the saints, and the 12 convened and had a council in which this brother, who was destitute, penniless, and they actually, Brigham said, all of us are going to give this man some money so he can buy a team and a wagon and supplies so he can join us on the westward trip. And I mean, if you adjust it for inflation, it was thousands of dollars each that they gave to this man as a gift. And so like Brigham was like, because the guy had I forget his name. I have it all in notes somewhere. The guy had expressed his concern about racism in the church. Understandably, it's a kind of a hot topic in the 1840s. And so Brigham's like, oh no, we have a great brother, Elijah Abel. We have a branch president up in New England area, Walker Lewis. There is no racism from us, from the 12. And he's like, maybe there's individuals, but they do not represent the church in those sentiments. And to show his good faith, they all raised this money, and so he joined them on their trek west. The sad part is that he abused that trust and started kind of messing around with some of the young women, it's daughters of some of the brethren. And when he was found out, he was obviously excommunicated, cast out from the church fellowship. And that was, I believe, the catalyst to where Brigham took a much hardline stance. And Brigham, when he said, "Thus saith the Lord," and issued the priesthood ban, all he actually did was quote Abraham chapter 1, "Thus saith the Lord," and then the Abraham chapter 1 verse like 21 or 24, somewhere around there. And who did not, the seed of Cain, or the Canaanites, who did not have a right to the priesthood. And he never claimed a revelation beyond Abraham chapter 1. Now I can quote the Lord. I can say, "Thus saith the Lord," and just quote a scripture, So it doesn't mean that necessarily it was God's will, is what I'm getting at. And so, but I don't blame Brigham, given the circumstances, because in context, you just had this kind of wolf come among and do harm to some of the women in your flock that you have stewardship over. And so was it, in my opinion, an overreaction? Personally, I think that it is possible that was a severe overreaction and it was a mistake to begin with. But in 1978, obviously, President Kimball felt very strongly that the time had come to reverse that position. And so today, I think it's a good thing that there is not a priesthood ban on the basis of race within the church.
You've been a great sport with my questions. They weren't easy questions. Thank you.
Yeah.
My last question just is what theory did you come up with? So you can do that now, or you can ask me whatever works for you.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So I'm gonna present a few ideas, so bear with me. This might take a little while, but I'm gonna go through and start off with just dive right in. So in Carthage, so we know that the door hinges are on the right side of the door if you're viewing from inside the room, and there's evidence that a shot was fired through the latch and lock by the mob attempting to enter the room. We know that Hiram could have sprung backward 2 or 3 steps as a reaction to that shot, as the eyewitness accounts, like John Taylor's account, states that. Or, if they shot through the lock and latch and then the mob members just pushed through the door, it could have pushed him back 2 or 3 steps, which is about 10 feet if you're a man my size. So anyone else that was to Hiram's right wouldn't have been knocked back as far if Hiram was knocked back and didn't just jump back a couple of steps, because you're closer to the hinges and there wouldn't be as much mass displacement. So it to me makes complete sense that Hiram was pushed much further back into the room away from the door. And that position, I mean, that we know that room is not very big. So that position, 10 feet back from the door, would put Hiram's back just a few feet away from the window, making it a target to anyone outside the jail. I believe it's most likely that the first bullet that struck his body was the one in his back, which would not have to cause very much external bleeding, because there's no major blood vessels in that area of the body. And since we know it didn't exit the front of his body, we can be fairly confident, based on the evidence, that regardless of the cause, the bullet that struck Hiram's back had low terminal ballistic energy. If it had higher terminal ballistic energy, we would expect it to have exited and had an exit wound. So we don't know the caliber of that bullet that struck him in the back. We don't know the firearm that it was shot from for sure. I mean, the hole in his shirt is 0.69 inches, which would be a perfect match for a period musket ball that was shot. But the low terminal ballistics could also be explained by it traveling a much further distance. Like, for example, if it had been fired from much further away from the jail. So like John Taylor, he never claimed he knew the exact source of the bullet that struck Hiram's back, but he conjectured in his account that it could have come from the Carthage graves, which he estimated at 10 to 12 rods, which is about 165 to 200 feet, or roughly 60 yards away, which is well within the effective range of a musket. Rifles, even of that period, were accurate to hundreds of yards, 200, 300, 400 yards away. A good rifleman could hit a target. So an alternative but equally plausible argument, like you said that you had agreed with Sam Weston that he disproved the RLDS angles from the Carthage conspiracy. It's possible that the shot from in the back could have come from a mob member much closer to the jail, but again, it would have had to have a much lower powder load to explain the low terminal ballistics, causing it to not exit the front of his body. Another possibility is if the shooter was shooting from the top of a wagon or from some other elevated position, he could have been much closer to the jail than the 50 to 70 feet away that Sam Weston calculated was possible. But regardless, either way, Hiram would have known immediately that his gunshot wound to his back was fatal, given the internal damage he could probably feel, and also due to the lack of medical technology back in those days. So Hiram said, "I am a dead man," and he still had a tongue because that was
Yeah.
the only ball that had struck him. So now what's interesting. So my background professionally, I deal with medical code data. I manage medical coding databases, and I study quite a bit about human anatomy and such, and so it's a common and widely known phenomenon that people who get shot with a firearm collapse immediately, even if it which kind of is a little counterintuitive, because if the bullet doesn't strike a lower extremity, why do people fall down? Well, a neurologist named Dennis Tobin was asked by a journalist investigating this phenomenon in 2013, and Dr. Tobin theorized that an area of the brain stem called the reticular activating system, or RAS, can become overloaded by pain impulses. So if you have intensely a lot of pain impulses, it comes in. Actually, the RAS is at the base of the brain stem. So the agony of being shot triggers the RAS to send out a signal weakening the muscles of the legs, causes the person to collapse. And I was prepared with a source link, so I'm gonna just stick that right here while we're talking. So anyway, that so that would explain Hiram collapsing, falling to his knees. So it wouldn't necessarily have caused him to move forward. I mean, it may have given him a slight push forward, i.e. towards the door. But it's very likely he fell to his knees and began to fall forward simply because, anatomically, men fall forward. When we get shot by a gun, our center of mass is in the front, just right below the sternum, kind of at the top of the stomach. And so men naturally fall forward when they collapse. Women fall backwards because a woman's center of gravity is in the region of the buttocks, and so it's much lower and in their rear center of gravity, so they fall backwards. So now, as he was falling to his knees and then began to fall forward, Hiram would have also had a natural, biological reaction to investigate what he probably was expecting to see as an exit wound. I mean, we know it struck his pocket watch in his right breast pocket, and so if you do it, if you just start to, I don't have a pocket right here, but if I started to glance down at my right breast pocket, you'll notice that I am exposing the left side of my nose to a shot directly in front of me. So while Hiram's head was beginning to bend down and to examine his chest, and while likely beginning to fall forward, and so immediately after uttering the words, "I'm a dead man," that's when I believe the ball that penetrated the door was fired and struck him, entering on the left side of his nose. And so, basically, Hiram was being 10 feet back from the door. That addresses the angle of the bullet hole in the door. And that would also account for there being no muzzle burn from the muzzle flash and no splintering from the door, etc. So the ball entered on the left side of his nose, exited below his jaw, but above his neck. So now it's important to note that the only point of evidence against the neck that the neck wound was an entrance wound was the coroner's report, and he identified it as an entrance wound. But what's very interesting, and what I found doing some research, was that modern trauma surgeons have determined that entrance and exit wounds are misinterpreted over half the time, even today, 52% of the time to be exact, which I have that source link. I'm gonna post here in the comments as well. And so because of this phenomenon of misidentifying it over half the time, I'm quoting from another journal article, current forensic recommendations are that trauma clinicians not document the interpretation of a wound as an entrance or exit. The wound should only be described in detail and, if possible, photographed, unquote. And so that article was published on the National Library of Medicine. And there's that link right there. So basically, the modern surgeons and forensics experts are, I mean, I don't think it's a stretch to say they're far more trained and have far more technological tools at their disposal than existed 180 years ago on the American frontier. And so I can only imagine that even more than 50% of the time, entry and exit wounds were misidentified in the 1840s. So that doesn't necessarily discredit the coroner, or, you know, it's not intended to be a criticism of him or him. It's just that these things are difficult to identify. And so modern protocol is to not identify or interpret those things. So now, in addition, so we know that bullets are not lasers. So that same peer-reviewed article that was published in the National Library of Medicine that I just linked, it says, quote, bullets that strike rigid changes in density, such as bone, will often be deflected from their initial course. So these are not my words. These are the words of actual forensics experts in a printed, published, peer-reviewed study in the National Library of Medicine. In fact, that same study goes on to reference a specific case where, quote, a bullet had penetrated the chest, entered the left pulmonary vein, or, you know, the vein on the left side of the lungs, and embolized to the left femoral artery. So, I mean, just let that sink in. Imagine somebody gets shot by a gun, a modern firearm, not a 180 years ago firearm, and it hits them in the chest, and there's no exit wound in their back, and they're like, where's the bullet? They find it in his left thigh. I mean, you know, truth can be stranger than fiction, in other words. And so it's not uncommon for bullet trajectories to change in unpredictable and sometimes dramatic ways after impacting or penetrating a human body. And so given that this particular bullet that struck the left side of Hiram's face was most likely a roughly 50 caliber or half-inch diameter musket ball that had just passed through 3/4 of an inch of solid hardwood. So upon striking Hiram's face bones while his head was angled slightly downward, the ball's trajectory changed slightly more down. And as it exited here, it grazed Hiram's vest in 2 places, which we know from the shirt, there is evidence that a bullet grazed him. It didn't penetrate the skin. There's no record of that, but it did graze his vest in 2 places. So those 2 graze marks could be examined today. I haven't examined them. I don't think you have either. But so after receiving that wound to his face, Hiram then fell to the floor. I believe it was face down, at least initially. And, you know, the eyewitness accounts do put him lying on his back. I think it's very possible that he could have been rolled over onto his back at some point in all the chaos. But I do think that he fell on his face initially, because that matches the biological center of mass argument. And I'm not faulting the eyewitness accounts for getting that little detail wrong, because, you know, he could have easily been flipped over to you know, positively determine that he was deceased.
Flipped over by them, or you mean
yeah,
after the fact?
or by anyone. So I believe that he bled out, and the actual cause of death was deprivation of oxygen to the brain.
From
Now,
the head wound?
no, because here's the thing: like, to bleed out, it's a surprising amount of blood. I mean, imagine in your mind, like, a half-gallon jug of milk. Imagine dumping that onto the floor once, a full half-gallon jug of milk, and then filling it halfway up again and dumping it out. That's about how much blood is in a full-grown male human being. And so to bleed out would cause, from his face, there would be a huge puddle. And so, but because the back wound, there would be very little external bleeding, but inside your body, inside your abdominal cavity, there's a lot of empty space that your guts are just kind of, floating around in. And so I believe the majority of him bleeding out happened internally, which was not externally visible. And so, and because he was laying on his face, at least initially, it did not exit the hole in his back. So, and then when the mob returned and opened fire at John Taylor and Joseph's, Hiram's corpse was struck twice more in lower extremities, but no sign of blood. So he was probably bleeding out. And
So you believe that the mob came back?
Yeah. Okay, so I guess before I go on to the evidence that after Joseph fired the 6-shooter through the door, went the gap. So, but before we get to that, I do think it's cool to mention, actually, and I'll attribute this. I'll give credit where it's due. So Kim sent me some sources that showed that there's documentation that both Joseph's and Hiram's bodies were placed on ice after they were martyred. Now, of course, back in those days, people didn't have freezers or fridges or electricity. So what they'd do is in the middle of winter, they'd go to the nearest lake or pond or stream. They'd cut large blocks of ice. They'd carry them by wagon or sleigh to the local ice house, which, as the name suggests, was a special, extra insulated structure designed to store ice long term. And they'd pack the ice blocks in sawdust. Now, amazingly, these ice blocks would last well into the summer, sometimes through the summer. And you can Google this stuff. Like if this isn't, it's this, I like to read old Westerns and pioneer types of books. And so I grew up, being aware of this, but if it's not something that you've ever seen before, feel free to Google it and just kind of validate this for yourself. So the reason that this is important is, as any mother would know, if blood gets onto fabric, like your kid gets a bloody nose or whatever, you don't want it to permanently stain the outfit. You take it off and soak it in cold water. So in other words, cold temperatures arrest the staining effect of blood. Now, the reason I think this is noteworthy is because, while I did say that there were no major blood vessels in the region where Hiram was struck in the back, there are small capillaries in the skin that I would expect to see at least some bleeding. And yet Hiram's shirt has no blood stains on the back whatsoever, despite a .69 caliber bullet hole being there. So I believe that the explanation there is that when they placed his and Joseph's bodies on ice, it prevented the blood stains on his back from becoming permanent, and so they were able to be washed out later. Okay, so back to the room in Carthage. So immediately after Hiram was struck with the first bullet in his back, hearing him cry that he was a dead man, Joseph exclaimed, "Oh, my dear brother Hiram," and made the decision to fire his 6-shooter revolver at the men trying to enter the door. I believe Joseph would have never left the room, because from his point of view, there was literally a mob of armed men on the other side of the door that he knew were intent on killing him. They had just killed his brother. So he drew the weapon, shot through the opening of the door, hitting 3 mob members, and apparently it misfired 3 times. But that caused the mob to temporarily retreat. How long? Maybe a few seconds, maybe a minute or 2. I don't know. But I believe that the mob quickly regrouped and could be heard coming back up the stairs to finish the job they'd come to do. Now, as they could hear the mob returning, that's when John Taylor decided to check if there was any hope of escape from the window. And he was struck by bullets shot from the mob members at the door coming into the room, and he thought he would fall out the window because he was leaning forward. He thought it was going to fall out at the time, and he didn't know why he didn't, and fell down inside the room. Now later on, it was discovered that his pocket watch was broken and had a small caliber bullet hole in it, which was speculated had been struck by a bullet from outside, and that was the reason John Taylor hadn't fallen out the window. Now, since your documentary attempted to portray that could have never happened, I'm going to just say here that the results of your experiment, you shooting the pocket watch, don't surprise me at all, because it was a apples to oranges comparison. So the reason I'm going to say that is because to actually replicate and test the effect of shooting a pocket watch that was on a human person's body, you'd need to use some representation of a human body as the backdrop. Because when a bullet strikes a target, there's forces, which in the laws of physics are defined as, mass times velocity. Bullets are small in mass, but very high velocity. So there's an amazing amount of force packed in a small package. That force, when it encounters an equal or opposite force, gets transferred. That kinetic force, that movement gets transferred into the target. Now, not enough to blow a guy back 20 feet like in Hollywood. That's just fantasy. But if a man was off balance, like falling forward, and a bullet struck and was brought to a complete stop by something in the man's pocket, is it plausible that it could change the direction he was falling? Absolutely, yes. In addition, if that energy was dispersed through the human body behind the watch, and the watch didn't absorb all of that energy, it wouldn't necessarily have to be blown to shreds. So in your experiment, you had a wooden board behind it, and so all of that force from the bullet impacting was absorbed by the watch, and predictably it got blown to shreds. That's expected by anybody that understands terminal ballistics. But so my point is that your setup was fundamentally flawed. Now, also the caliber of the bullet that struck John Taylor's pocket watch was not a 69 caliber musket ball, which would have a lot more force because it's a lot more mass. And so the hole in his pocket watch is pretty small. Like I've never actually handled the pocket watch and measured the diameter, but to me, it looks more like a 22 type of a caliber, which would have been fired from a sidearm, not a musket, by one of the mob members below. Okay, so John is struck by 4 balls, falls to the floor, rolls under the bed. Now, there was a point of there being 2 windows in the room. So if John went to the smaller window, that could explain why Joseph would go to the other larger window. But regardless, even if John Taylor went to the larger window, which would make more sense in my mind, that he was afraid that he was going to fall out.
What do you mean? There's 3 windows. Which 2 windows are you talking about?
I'm referring to, there's the large window, which is directly across from the door. And then there's if you're like, we always put the door on the left side, all the painters' depictions, and because the door's in the far left corner. And so we always look at it from that perspective. So if the door's on the left, the window's on the right, there was another window behind, above where the bed was, right?
So he jumped on the bed and tried to go through that window. Is that what you mean?
Possibly. He doesn't, there's no action. I didn't see any indication from either of the eyewitness accounts, him identifying specifically which window he went to. I'm just saying that regardless, if he went to the window above the bed, that could explain why Joseph would go to the other window across from the door, right? But even if John Taylor went to the large window directly across the opposite wall from the door, I think it's still reasonable, given that there were no other possible exits or escapes from that room, from that situation, besides a window. So anyway, as Joseph rushes to the window, the mob, which has breached the door, fires upon him from behind. And Willard, of course, was hidden from view of the mob because he was on the hinge side of the door. So the mob forces the door open, forces him into the corner behind the door. He is out of sight, out of mind, maybe.
So do you believe that's just your theory, or because he said he was on the other side, but then told the coroner that he was behind the door? So
I think that in the heat of the moment, in the stress, it's very likely he could have misremembered upon later recollection.
He misremembered that he was behind the door the whole time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Especially if human nature is to embellish over time. And in fact, it would be remarkable if people didn't. That's why they call them the big fish stories, right? The fish gets bigger and bigger the more times you tell the story. And that's just a natural part of human nature. That doesn't mean that it wasn't a big fish to begin with. It just means that over time, things tend to get exaggerated, and that's just human nature. So I have no problem. I'm not accusing Willard of being like a malicious liar for making embellishments if he did that. I just believe that it's far more likely the fact that he was never struck by balls, unless possibly the ear grazing. But I think that it's far more likely that he was behind the door at the time that Joseph was fired upon. And so anyway, so in the act of Joseph trying to jump out the window, he was struck by balls shot from behind, from the mob at the door of the room, as well as in front. And as a result of those shots, he stumbled and fell headfirst out of the window, hit the ground with his forehead first. And there's evidence that he was not instantly killed, because he leaned up against the wall and was beaten, at least according to one of the mob members, before he died. And so Willard, if he was behind the door, and the mob immediately rushed out after, Joseph was their target, clearly. And so as the mob saw that he was no longer in the room, they would have rushed out and down the stairs. And so Willard would have been relatively safe. Now, he's a big guy for sure, about 300 pounds by accounts. But like we discussed last time, nobody's going to approach a window casually when you just saw your friend, or two of your friends, or maybe three. Like, so Hiram, John, and Joseph were all shot through this same window minutes before. He would have crept up and he would have, peeked over the bottom of the sill. Now, today the ledge might have a larger overhang. Maybe back in 1844 it was the same ledge, or maybe it was replaced in one of the multiple remodels since that time. Regardless, it's possible that his ear was grazed by a stray shot. It doesn't necessarily mean that if it wasn't, it makes him a liar, because again, human nature is to embellish things over time. But he wouldn't have just been sitting there like staring. He would have glanced quickly and then ducked back under cover. So the idea that he had to fill the window is just unsupported by human nature, let alone any historical evidence. And so now, so if the martyrdom happened today, I think this is important. Another important point is, like, in a modern forensics team went to the untampered with crime scene, sure, it's likely they'd be able to determine tons more facts than what we have access to today. But the facts of this matter is that the martyrdom happened nearly 180 years ago. Modern forensic tech did not exist at the time. The bodies have been buried. There's no crime scene. It's been 180 years. The jail's been remodeled. So like, we don't have the bullets. We don't have blood splatters. We don't have pictures of the bodies where they were lying. The crime scene has been tampered with, obviously. We don't have the murder weapons or the muskets that were involved. We don't have the pistols. I think I already said that, but it was like multiple remodels in the time. So there was a blood stain, apparently, on the floor up until, I think it was President Kimball in the 60s or 70s or something, said, let's clean that up. And so we know that the window and the frame were replaced. And so that could have easily included the window ledge. Also, another important thing is, back east, like I served a mission in Detroit, and I've spent time working in the South in the summertime and stuff. It's very common to pressure wash the exteriors of buildings out there, just because of the climate. And so, like, in addition to 180 years worth of weathering, to me, pressure washing could explain why, modern visitors, we go and we don't see visible evidence of musket balls striking the exterior. Okay, so that's kind of the theory, but I have just a few final statements, if that's okay, before you dive in and ask questions. Is that cool?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right on. So I think it's important to say that it's impossible for me to actually prove my own theory, that's what really happened. As you stated multiple times in our last conversation. Now you said, I kind of tried to ask you a couple of different times, couple of different ways about motive, like asked you to speak to motive, which you declined to do. but as a quick aside, I have a good friend. His brother has been a homicide detective in Arizona for many years, and I didn't, no context. I just asked, and he said that as a homicide detective, he would never consider investigating forensic evidence in a vacuum, like without investigating motive. So anyway, as I thought through all of these points, I anticipated several possible objections that you could bring up to discredit my story, my theory. And as I was thinking about it, I realized something very important that you said a few times in our last meeting, and that's about epistemology. Are you familiar with that term? Kind of a scholarly. So epistemology just being, how do you determine what is true? And I think, that, well, I heard you say many times that you believe that what is most likely is probably what is true. So your epistemology would be what is the most likely, what is probable. Probability would be your epistemology in this situation, and explicitly, like exclusively based on the forensic evidence. So to kind of just illustrate what that means, the implications is, like, if we take 2 dice and we roll them, it must be a 7. The result must be a 7. We don't look at the results and look at it. We say it has to be a 7 because that is the highest probability outcome. It couldn't be a 2, couldn't be a 12, because those are less probable than a 7. There's way more combinations of dice to get to 7. And so that's the most likely. Or similarly, the odds of a person who buys lottery tickets, or who like goes and plays a slot machine in Vegas, their odds of winning the jackpot are statistically minuscule, like infinitesimally small. And so by your epistemology, it would be impossible for anyone to ever win the lottery or the jackpot because it's so unlikely. And yet we all know it happens every day to all sorts of people. So this is my objective analysis of a fundamental flaw to your approach. In addition, let's define another term that you like to throw around, the forensic science. Like, forensic science is scientific, meaning there's no room for conjecture. So this requires being able to examine and positively identify the bullet, location of impact, trajectory or trajectories involved in a pristine, uncontaminated, and controlled scene. That being the case, as you said in our last conversation, that like you had to make a bunch of assumptions and fill in holes in your conclusions as you presented them. That's not forensic science. Science is disciplined. It's reproducible. It's neither of us has actually seen the bullets. Neither of us has actually handled the murder weapons. Neither of us has physically examined the shirt or the skull or the pocket watch. Maybe you have, I don't know, I haven't, or examined the room in its condition immediately after the martyrdom. In other words, neither of us has any business to even claim the forensic evidence can provide a scientific answer. We have very little. We have a hole in a door, we have some pictures of some skulls, and we have a shirt with some holes and bloodstains. That's about it. But anyway, so despite your epistemology being what is the most probable thing, I don't believe your documentary is even about that. Because, like, what's the probability that John Taylor and Willard Richards were armed when we know there was no evidence whatsoever they had guns with them in that room? Also, motive is a massive aspect of probability. Like, anybody, I like enjoy reading and watching murder mysteries. Anybody that sees a murder mystery knows that if I had told you that a guy had threatened to divorce his wife and was not going to give her support, and then the next day he's found dead, probability would make the wife, the widow, a leading suspect in that investigation. So, like, in the context of Carthage, what is the probability that 2 guys are going to stage a murder of 2 friends while they're in the room with them, and a mob with guns is shooting at their targets? Like, there are so many more probable ways that if John and Willard wanted to kill Joseph and Hiram, they could have poisoned them. No risk to themselves. Joseph and Hiram, we know, were unarmed on their trip from Nauvoo to Carthage, meaning they could have killed him in transit. Like, at any point on that road where there's no witnesses, a mob wasn't shooting at them, they weren't possibly able to get caught in the crossfire. So why pick a room when you're right next to your intended victims and incite a mob to only hang him. And yet you did acknowledge that shots were fired from the mob outside. So to me, a much better epistemology than probability is reason. Like, for example, our legal system is more concerned about finding the truth than any other, earthly institution, because justice cannot be served, cannot prevail if the truth is not reached. So for this reason, the standard of our justice system is reason, not probability. It's worth noting that there's no positive evidence that John Taylor or Willard Richards did anything that they are being accused of to begin with. Like, the theory that, as you present it, serves only to fill holes in improbabilities of the reasonable narrative presented from day one by the eyewitnesses. That being said, I am willing to go there. I'm willing to stoop to the standard that you've imposed and present a narrative that only looks to explain the less probable aspects of the accepted story, like yours, but with greater probability than your theory. So those are the ground rules. We can introduce things that there was no evidence of to explain the things that there is evidence of. So I now present my probable theory, not my reasonable theory. I've presented that before, but this is my probable theory. And it literally checks every box in your list of 6 that you came up with, along with every other box that anyone else could ever come up with. I'm going to call it the aliens theory. I mean, if you don't like that, it's okay. I have more. Maybe Governor Boggs did it. Maybe a time traveler did it. Maybe the Clintons did it. Maybe an angel did it. But so anyway, my new theory might sound really crazy at first, but in case you're not aware, like, the United States government, led by all the top brass in the Pentagon, have now officially acknowledged that UFOs exist. That means that aliens are probably real, unless you think the Foo Fighters were German technology, like light years ahead of where we are today, but they still lost World War II. So I think that the most probable theory of all, based exclusively off the forensic evidence, is that aliens killed Joseph and Hiram in Carthage. They made it look like it was done by men. The aliens then wiped John Taylor's and Willard Richards and all the mob members who thought they remembered being there and seeing what had happened. They replaced their memories with the chaotic and inconsistent recollections that we have record of today. So just going to go through the 6 check boxes real quick. So window angle. With the aliens theory, aliens can fly and shoot through walls. They could hover outside the window. They could teleport into the room. They could shoot downward. Any angle is feasible, but especially Hiram's face shot. Like, it could have come from directly above, which, if you dismiss the trajectory change explanation in my reasonable theory, it still completely explains how the bullet goes straight through without hitting his torso, because it came from directly above him. It's the best explanation based exclusively on the forensic evidence. Only aliens could have made a shot from above like that. Point 2, muzzle energy. The aliens were replicating 1840s musket tech to hide their involvement. But they have technology to travel to the stars. They could, put as much velocity into lead ball as they want. Probably could make it bend around corners, speed up, slow down, alien tech. So, point 3, I'm a dead man. Hiram, being a spiritually sensitive man, could sense the aliens were there to kill him, and he knew nothing could stop them, even if the entire mob turned on the aliens. So that's why he says those words, "I'm a dead man," with such certainty. Point 4, the 5-degree bullet angle hole. Similar to the points 1 and 2, aliens can fly and teleport. They were replicating the 1840s firearm technology, since they obviously needed to hide their involvement. Point 5, the skull damage. It's actually not even likely that those are the real skulls. Genetic testing was never done. They could have been misidentified. The aliens probably took the Smiths' bodies and replaced the real ones with fake ones after they were buried. So who knows whose skulls those are? Or maybe the aliens just 3D printed them. And then point 6, the no blood stains. Here again, the aliens' weapons were not actually muskets. They must have heated the lead, and it just cauterized the entrance wounds. That's the real reason there's so little blood. Because like, if the demonstrations in the film are correct with the exploding heads and everything, that's like the only explanation that really makes sense for the lack of blood, is some kind of alien weapon technology. And then one last thing is, Kim called me the other day. I think it was last Friday, and told me, like, you'll never guess who she just bumped into. Um, so she was at a symposium. Sam Weston was there. They bumped into each other, and she asked him, like, when you were interviewing Sam for the documentary, she asked Sam if he knew what you were doing with the information, and Sam's response was that he thought you were just using it for your own personal research, that you were just trying to do some research. And he said that at some future date you said you'd like to make a movie or documentary, but that you gave him no clue that that's what he was filming for at the time, or he wouldn't have gotten involved, especially if he had known how it was going to turn out. He said that you came on as a really good Latter-day Saint who just wanted to find out the truth, and so he was, of course, anxious to help because he'd like to see the truth too. But he felt very duped, and so, then the follow-up question was asked, so you don't support his theory? And Sam said, no, not at all. She asked, well, have you reached out to him and told him what you see wrong with his film? And Sam said, oh yeah. I said, if just quoting his words exactly, because I transcribed it, he said that had I, Sam Weston, this is kind of weird grammar. He said that you, Justin, you should have invited me, Sam, to the opening. You should have told me that I'm doing this. We talked there and communicated and sat there at the Church History Museum. He put in there that I worked for the church, which I don't work for the church. Sam doesn't work for the church. And he said that he had to write letters to the church explaining that he didn't know anything about what you're doing. He didn't represent himself as a church employee. And if the church hears things like that, they're not true. He said that he didn't sign a release to say, or anything to say that you were authorized to use the footage, just that you came off it, you were using it for your personal research. And Sam said that he does not believe in anything that was presented, especially the conclusion. It was very far out there. So final question, and then you're up. But so why did you edit and censor Sam's original footage and then publish it without his permission?
So Sam did know I was making a documentary. That's how I engaged him, was through email. He was referred to me by Casey. And so the first thing I said to him is, I'm making a documentary. I'd love to come and talk to you about your theory. So he knew I was making a documentary, and I was filming him the entire time. And at that time that I filmed him, that was really early on in the process of making the movie. And at that point, all I was doing was interviewing people. Everyone that had some sort of a theory or idea about what happened, I was just interviewing people. I did not have my own theory at that point. But I did bring up to him the other theories, the Lyons brothers. We discussed it. We talked about Gary Smith, and we even talked about Carthage. We talked about our Carthage conspiracy theory. So he knew, he was familiar with all of those theories too. It was a great conversation. And I probably had maybe an hour or two of footage from that conversation. So I had to cut it down. But I didn't commentate over it. I let him explain his theory, exactly how he wanted to explain it. So it was a big mistake not to invite him to the premiere. It was a huge mistake. And a couple of weeks after it premiered, he reached out to me and he's like, what the heck, why didn't you invite me to that? And I apologized profusely. I was like, you're right. I definitely should have invited you. And so I thought that we had worked that out. It was a mistake. I should have invited him to the premiere. Now, so obviously he doesn't agree with my theory, and we talked about it further. He had said that he had come up with some new evidence to show his theory even further. And I was like, great, what is it? And he's like, I'll get back to you. And then I didn't hear from him again until Kimberly ran into him. And then Kimberly came and made her big post about, oh, I screwed him over. He didn't know he was on a documentary, and I misrepresented his theory. And I called Sam immediately, or I didn't call him, I emailed him. I'm like, Sam, you watched the movie. Did I misrepresent your theory? And he goes, no, she is saying that incorrect. You did not misrepresent my theory. And I was like, okay. what's missing then? And he's like, well, you didn't show the entire context of everything. And I said, you tell me what context that you want added in, and I will do that. And I will use my platform to fix whatever you feel like I didn't represent you correctly. And he said, well, I'd rather you just take the whole film down. And I was like, well, I'm not going to do that. But think about it. And if there's something I said wrong, if you want to be in part two, you want to, or have your own part, I'll film you. I will use my platform to fix it, because I had no desire to misrepresent what he said. As far as working for the church, I don't think I said he worked for the church. I said he worked for the museum, which he does. He's worked for the Church History Museum for 9 years. I don't know the difference between how that got interpreted by people that he works for the church, but I did understand his position, that it put him in a rough spot, because the church is like, why are you doing this? So again, another one of the things I apologize to him for. But my intent when I put him in the movie was to show how great he is, to show how awesome his theory is. And I said that in the movie. This is a fantastic theory. There's very few people that have researched it more than him. And he has an in with the church. He's the one that he conducted the study of the church with 16 different watches of that time period, shot them all from all different weapons, all different angles, and conclusively proved that John Taylor's watch was not shot. He's in charge of that. They're letting him test the shirts for blood, which is huge. And I'm like, dude, you have access to the church. You have their ear. They have so many resources. Let's get the church to look at all of these things, and not just these two, just the shirt. Let's look at all of it, the whole history of it, and see if we can come up with something together. So I wanted him. He's made out to be the church's hero in the movie. I mean, the Line brothers are great, but I couldn't interview them. They had already passed, and I hadn't talked with Gary. But Gary's theory relies way more on the Line brothers theory, and then he just adds the part at the end about the shirt. So I haven't had a chance to talk with Gary. That was a lot of rambling. Did I answer your question? That's the history of me and Sam. So I love Sam. I don't want to in any way hurt him. I don't want to change his theory. I want to present it exactly the way that he wants it presented, in the right context. If he feels that there's something missing, some choice that I made out of the footage that I didn't show, I'm happy to say, okay, let's refilm it in any way you want and present it. I have no problem with that.
Okay. I mean, so I guess full disclosure, the reason I was able to quote his exact words is because Kim recorded it, and she had permission. He said that she was welcome to do that, and that's not what he said to her on this recording. So there's a disconnect.
Maybe he said something different to both of us. I don't know. But yeah, I have the email. So, but I'm not trying to implicate Sam, but I have the email. I can show you the emails.
So you have been in contact with him recently. Okay.
Yeah. Well, as soon as she posted that, I immediately reached out to him. I'm like, Sam, you really feel this way? And he said, no, she did not say that. I never said that. And I was like, okay, well, what is wrong? What happened? And that's when he said, I felt like, you didn't explain the full context of what I said. And I said, did I misrepresent your theory? And he said, no, you didn't. And I'm like, well, that's good, because it is. I mean, it's exactly what his theory. If he changed it since then, that's different. And I think he should have the opportunity to update it, but he hasn't. So that's the same theory that I presented in the movie. It's very clear what his theory is.
Okay.
Which it seems like you understand his theory better now too, because you incorporated a lot of that into your new theory.
Well, actually, I had never heard Sam's theory besides the snippets that you included in the final cut. So I was actually surprised when Kim told me that my theory was very similar to Sam's theory, because we arrived at those completely independently.
Did you not watch the full documentary?
I did.
So I gave Sam's full detail. He had more time than anyone else on screen explaining his theory. Anyway, whatever, I don't care. If you came up with it on your own, great. I loved your theory. I thought it was fantastic. You're like the only person since the movie who's come up with a new theory. that looked at the evidence. I love it. I absolutely love it. I've taken notes and I want to go run it through a couple of things and then respond to it. But well done. I loved it because I think I understand the point you were making of your alien theory. I don't think you think that's really what happened. I could be
It's
wrong.
just the most probable thing based exclusively off the
Yeah,
evidence.
so you're using that to show the weakness of the epistemology of probability, correct? Okay, because I've heard the alien theory many times. There's the alien theory, there's the magic ball theory, and there's the it's impossible to know 200 years later theory, which is all great. But your first theory, I think it's fantastic. I'm like, well done. And the reason why I like it is the same approach I had and same approach the other theorists had. So there's a difference between you were talking about how I always bring up forensic evidence versus my theory that has a bunch of assumptions made in it. The forensic evidence is indisputable. There is a death mask. There is a picture of the skull. There is a, clothing with holes in it. Now you can dispute the meaning of it, absolutely, but you can't dispute that that evidence exists. But you look at that evidence, you have to come up with a story. What happened in those 2 to 3 minutes? You have to recreate the crime scene. And that's where the theory comes in, because it's impossible to do that with the evidence that's remaining. It's impossible to do that 100% accurately. I think it's impossible to do it if a crime was committed today. Tomorrow, you couldn't accurately say they walked this many feet through the door with this weapon in this angle. You can, with modern science, you can get way higher than we can from a 200-year crime scene, absolutely. But it's impossible to say exactly what happened.
Well, so I know trial attorneys who that's their job. Like the police, they work the prosecutor's office, the DA, they work with the law enforcement officers, and they literally enact, like what's the word? Recreate every step, every motion, and they present it, and that's the whole point of a criminal prosecution, is to show the jury what happened. And I mean, and I guess the other thing is, if there's a video camera with footage, like, you can know with certainty what actually happened with modern tech.
So that's why I went through that whole process in my movie, was to say, here it all is. Here's how this all would have happened with what I'm saying with this evidence. Rather than, the crux of my theory is the one shot, but it entered here and exited here. But instead of just focusing on that, I said, here's the whole recreation, because that's what the eyewitnesses did. They gave the whole recreation of it. And most of the theories, they gave a whole recreation of how that all would have played out, if that makes sense, rather than just the main crux of their theory. So that's why I did that.
Well, but the thing is, you didn't just say that this was an entrance wound, this was an exit wound. You accused John Taylor of being the man that pulled the trigger.
Yes.
Yeah. So
right,
like,
because I had to explain, I didn't want to just say this is an entry and this is an exit. I had to explain, how was that shot made? Now you run through the possibilities of how a shot like that is made, because your head has to be kinked back like this, or it has to have been a suicide shot. There's only so many ways that you can get the angle of a shot that enters here and exits here.
So what forensic evidence shows that John Taylor made the shot?
Okay, so the main evidence that I used in the film was that shot, first of all, could not have been a musket. It had to have been a smaller arm, smaller rifle, or a smaller pistol, which they both said that everything was muskets. So I'm like, okay, how, even if it was a rifle, how would you get a rifle under there? So whatever happened that caused that shot that entered here and exited there would require, when you're looking at the evidence.
But why single out John? Because there was two other guys in the room with him. Why not Joseph?
I'll get to that. So the reason why, and by the way, when you're presenting a case in court, when I was talking to my attorney friends about this, if you can't get to 100% probability, and some crimes maybe you can't, I don't think you can, but you can get pretty close. The idea of the court system is to argue both sides as vehemently as you can, and then let the jury decide which way they are convinced, and the jury will be convinced. You called it being reasonable. I'm like, yeah, I agree with that. And for me, reasonability also goes along with probability. It's like not a for sure. It's like correlation. Correlation doesn't prove it for sure, but why does every scientist study correlation? It's to come up with probabilities. And so when you present to the jury, if you present a thing that's possible, like the alien thing that you talked about, yeah, it's possible. There's a million things that are impossible, and we can spend the whole jury's time going through 999,000 of them that are way unlikely, or we can stick with the ones that they have a higher probability of happening.
So we're back to the probability. We're back to the epistemology of probability in a court. Like, the standard is extremely high. It's not just what is reasonable, it's proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which is an extremely high bar. You cannot convict somebody based off of probability. You have to convince a jury on the basis of beyond a reasonable doubt. There has to be positive evidence, which there is not one shred of positive evidence that John Taylor had a gun, let alone he was the one that shot Hiram.
So there is positive evidence that he had a gun, if you accept testimony from people. Because
like who? Thomas Sharp? Okay, so I read the Thomas Sharp statement. That does not say that all 4 of the men were armed.
He did. He said all of the men in the jail were heavily armed.
He said, okay, if you are a mob rioter, insurrectionist trying to stir up public sentiment against people, you're going to try to make them out as terrible and bloody as possible. When there are 2 firearms and 4 men present, and you as an editor of a Warsaw Signal say all 4 of the men were heavily armed, that doesn't necessarily mean that every individual had his own personal firearm on his person. Besides, Thomas Sharp was not in that room.
Okay, so what
he was not at the scene.
Was there is no evidence, and I said yes, there is. You interpret it differently than I do, but are you willing to amend your statement and say yes, there is evidence, it's just not likely?
Not to the burden of not to the standard. The burden of proof is beyond reasonable doubt.
Okay, so you are admitting there is evidence, it's just not beyond a reasonable doubt, correct?
There is hearsay, which is not admissible.
Okay, so we have to take all of the eyewitness accounts out. Is that what you mean?
The eyewitness accounts are not hearsay. They are first-hand eyewitnesses.
I mean, we take out all accounts that anybody gave. We take that all out off the table as evidence. Is that what you're saying?
No, they were there. If they're there, it's not hearsay.
Okay, when you're so there, we only use the 2 eyewitness accounts. Is that what you mean?
Well, there were other mob members that testified that were there, so those would also be
that were in the room or witnessed inside the room.
No, that were present on the day. I'm not aware of any eyewitness accounts of the actual mob members who were in the room.
If what we're trying to prove is the 2 to 3 minutes, we can use other eyewitness accounts that were outside of the room, or we can't, is my question to you.
Say that again.
If we are trying to prove what happened inside the jail in those 2 to 3 minutes, we can or can't use eyewitness testimony of people that were out that didn't see inside the room in that 2 to 3 minutes.
Their testimony could be materially related to the events that happened inside the room. So in that case, absolutely. They were firsthand witnesses, eyewitnesses. They were not necessarily in the room. And so, like, to your point, Thomas Sharp was not in the vicinity when this happened. So he was he printed his evidence, as you call it, as complete hearsay, which is not admissible in court.
Okay, so what you're saying, you're confusing me. We can or we can't use the accounts of people that are outside of the room. We can, but only if they were there. Is that what you're saying?
If they were present, either before, during, or immediately after, then those constitute eyewitness accounts, firsthand testimony.
Okay, so, and were any of those describing what happened in the room?
So you can't use their accounts if they were not physically in the room. You can't use their accounts as testimony of the events that happened in the room. You can
Okay,
use their accounts as testimony of, I came up to the room and his body was lying there in this
great.
position, so forth.
So in the 2 to 3 minutes, okay, because again, I don't remember if it was you or Kimberly that accused me of not using all of those accounts in the movie. And I was like, that's why I didn't, is because they didn't say what happened in that room. It wasn't because I was discounting that they were fair or not evidence to be used. Or in fact, I agree with all the stuff that they're saying is going on outside of the jail. But within the jail, I was like, no.
But then why argue them now?
Describe what's in the 2 to 3 minutes.
But so if you didn't use them in the documentary, why are you using them now? Like,
so you said there is no evidence of them having guns, and if all we're going off of is the 2 eyewitness accounts, then I'm like, yeah, of course not. They don't mention guns at all. So I brought that up.
well,
But
we don't have to be completely reliant upon eyewitnesses. We have the doctor, we have the coroner, we have other people
right.
who all would have been around John and Hiram's and Joseph's corpse and
So
Willard,
this is
and
where
none
I
of them.
want to define equal grounds here, because you kicked Thomas Sharp out, and I think the reason why you defined it is because he wasn't there. But you're saying you can be there. I mean, what are you saying? That you can be, your account only matters if you were there, basically, right?
So if you have firsthand eyewitness testimony and you are measuring that against somebody who was not there, not in town, or or who heard things secondhand, the eyewitness, firsthand witnesses accounts are always going to have much more power, much more
So
credibility, much
Catherine
more.
said she was there to hear that Joseph turned around and pointed to someone of the 12, Catherine Smith, Joseph's sister.
Okay.
Was that a firsthand account?
I'm not sure. I'm
Yes,
not
she
sure
said
what
she was
you're.
there.
Catherine Smith said she was there in
Yes, a
Carthage.
couple of days before Joseph left for Carthage, and he gave some sort of a speech or sermon with people there. And he said someone on the stand, or no, he was talking about someone from the 12 was going to betray him. And then she said, and they did, and they were his friends, and they took over the church afterwards. So she was there, she heard him say it. Can we regard that as evidence of motive, or of evidence that it was an inside job?
So she heard it directly, but you're not saying that she was present in the jail cell.
No, this was a speech a couple of days before, I believe.
Okay. So, okay, but she was not the only one present at that speech.
Uh-huh.
And yet she was the sole person who had that recollection of what was said in that speech. Okay.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So if there are no witnesses, like the scriptures say, in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word shall be established. If there's only one witness, the scriptures throw it out. It's inadmissible. You cannot convict somebody with one witness. You need multiple witnesses. So why were there no other witnesses to corroborate Catherine's statement? And that again, by definition, would make it inadmissible.
So if John and Willard, again, according to your rules of analyzing what happened at Carthage, if John and Willard do not agree on details, we can throw those details out, or no?
That would be admissible, and the court would need to review that. But again, minutia is not the point of eyewitness accounts of something as chaotic.
So you call it minutia. I mean, there's over 100 inconsistencies. Some of them don't matter at all. And
so
what
that
you
would
have
be
to
the
do,
definition of minutia.
yeah, some of them don't. Like, for instance, John said all of their coats off. Willard says everyone but my coat was off. Who cares? I don't think it's material at all. Doesn't matter. However, were there 2 men against the door or were there 4 men against the door is much more important. And one said 2 and one said 4. So what I tried to judge in their inconsistencies was, is this just misremembering? A lot was going on, adrenaline flowing, who knows? Every eyewitness has misremembering moments. And this is exactly what attorneys do, and the jury must decide. Is, were they misremembering or are they lying?
So here's the thing. Police officers in general fire a lot more firearms, fire a lot more bullets, like at ranges, training and stuff, than anybody else. And yet even police officers, when they are being interviewed in a debrief, they're asked, how many bullets did you fire in this stressful situation? When you're under duress, you are not counting bangs. And so
Right.
officers are like, hey, it might have, I think I shot a couple, maybe 3-4 times. And they're like, actually you shot 18 rounds or whatever, and so like it is natural. It would be unusual if a man did have perfect recall of every detail and minutia and everything
Right.
that happened. So
That's
that's
a
why we
perfect
have to
example.
only look at the main events, which I mean,
So
I don't want
both
to
of them
necessarily.
perfectly describe Joseph shot 3 times and misfired 3 times. And there were same studies that you've read. How on
And
earth
that
did they get that detail correct?
and so here's the thing. That could easily not have been because they were counting the bangs in the moment, but because they examined the pistol after the fact, and there were 3 rounds that had not fired. So that's a very easy point that was not necessarily informed by direct observation in the moment in the heat of the battle, but because of what they saw after the fact and could independently verify in
Possibly.
a calmer state.
So that I think again is a reasonable explanation. What's not a reasonable explanation is that in the middle of a big gunfight, they both counted the number of shots that were successful and the number that were misfires. Or at
But
least that always
yeah,
hung in my mind as that's a weird detail that they both
but again,
repeat.
you don't accidentally forget because you're under stress that you murdered somebody.
Uh-huh.
You don't,
Okay, now
and you
let's
don't. There's
go
when there's
on.
no
You're right.
evidence that John Taylor had a gun.
Do you understand are we in agreement on how I was judging each inconsistency as, is this just misremembering or is this lying? Do you understand the
Yeah,
difference there? Okay.
for sure.
And is it fair to analyze the inconsistencies to say, okay, this one most likely was misremembered, or this one impossible, total lie, or somewhere in the middle, to judge it on that continuum?
No, like you can
Okay.
have opinions, but you cannot make judgments because that would require evidence, which
Okay,
we were not
that's
there.
exactly
We have
right.
no evidence.
So the eyewitnesses say, one say that Joseph, after Hiram died, one said that Joseph stayed at the door and shot through the door.
Mhm.
The other one say that Joseph ran to his brother, or that one said he had the gun in his hand, reached around, started shooting. The other eyewitness said he ran to his brother, John Taylor did, cuddled him, said, "Oh, my dear brother Hiram," then stood up with firm resolve, pulled the gun out, walked towards the door and started shooting. The two very different things. Is that them misremembering, or is that lying, or is that a little bit of embellishment, or what is that difference there? That's very different than we were all
Well,
wearing coats, we weren't all wearing coats.
it depends on where Joseph is in the room when Hiram is struck. If
So
Joseph's by
according
the
to McCary,
door,
he was 10 feet back. Hiram was 10 feet back. Joseph was at the door.
well,
Willard says he started reaching through and shooting. John says no, he walks the 10 feet to his brother, cuddles his brother, says, "Oh, my dear brother Hiram," to where then stands up, then pulls his pistol out of the gun or out of his pocket, and then comes towards the door. Is that lying or misremembering?
okay, bang, bang, bang. Which shot killed Hiram? Like when there's gunfire going on, it's very difficult. To me, what's more likely is the John Taylor recollection, because if Joseph was further back, like closer to the center of the room where Hiram ended and was struck at the beginning when that happened, it would be natural for Joseph to, you know, say, my dear brother Hiram, and then draw the pistol, walk to the door, and fire. So, but it again.
Okay, so how do you explain that inconsistency that Willard was just misremembering? Because he wrote about it that night and within 30 days. And he said Joseph stayed at the wall, said, "Oh, my dear brother Hiram," started firing. How on earth did Willard forget the detail of he went over to his brother, cradled him, then stood up and took his gun out of his pocket?
Or maybe John Taylor's recollection was out of sequence. Maybe he was standing by the wall, fired through the door, and then maybe he said, "Oh, my dear brother Hiram," fired through the door, and then went and cradled his brother. Like,
possibly, but he specifically said the gun was in his pocket when he went to his brother.
But again,
stood up and grabbed it and ran towards the door shooting.
So, but this is what is called, like, literally the definition of an ad hominem logical fallacy. You're assaulting, you're trying to weaken the credibility of their testimonies in order to justify and try to make that, weaponize that as evidence that they were murderers.
Yeah, I'm trying to determine, was that a misremembering or was that a lie?
It's immaterial.
Okay,
that does not matter. That either way, Justin, either way, neither way is that evidence that John Taylor killed Joseph or killed Hiram.
Now, here's where it gets interesting. If the shot entered here and exited here, is there any way that they, if that's the actual shot that was made, is there any way that they misremembered how that shot was made? Or was it a lie the way they described the shot was made?
Neither one of them said this was an entrance wound, this was an exit wound.
If that's the shot that happened, then they would have to have lied in their eyewitness accounts.
No,
or is it possible that no, that shot could have happened and they just misremembered?
No, again, it didn't even have to be misremembering. They might not, their focus was probably on the door. They might not have actually seen when Hiram was struck by the balls. They had a mob coming into the room shooting.
So if the door and the mob was at the door shooting, how would this kind of a shot get made on Hiram?
I already explained that in my reasonable theory.
No, you said this is the entry. I'm saying, how would a shot where this is the entry and come out of the nose? How do you make that shot?
I don't believe that this was the entry. I believe that was misidentified.
Don't believe that. I know you don't believe that. But if that was the shot that was made, how do you make that shot? Because I believe that that's the way that the shot was made.
Based on what? There's no evidence of that.
Yes, there is. And it's mostly the skull and the death mask. And that, okay, so let's say this was the entrance and that was the exit. There's too many other, to make a shot through here that exits here and only skims the body is highly difficult to make. He would have to, well, the Lyon brothers say the only way you can do that is if he was leaning forward, which is why they put him at the door. Otherwise, someone would have to run up to your head and stick a gun like this and shoot down. And even then your head would have to be tilted back like this for the body or for the bullet just to skim. So I went through both scenarios. Okay, let's say either of those shots happened. What's the scenario where what would that look like for someone to have made that shot? And then I'm like, okay, once I come up with that possibility, and maybe I came up with 10 different possibilities of ways that that shot could be made. In any of those possibilities, with what the eyewitnesses described, were they lying or misremembering? And in none of those possibilities is it possible that they just misremembered that shot was made. So it doesn't matter how they're made. Either of them, it doesn't matter how they made. Then the question becomes, why did the eyewitnesses get that so wrong? Now, your scenario, if it's possible, way different. I believe that if your scenario happened, that you could have misremembered. He was close enough in that position and the timing of getting shot in the back and falling forward, it works. Your scenario works, if that makes sense. So that's why I'm like, bro.
But I don't want to get away.
Think that one through.
But I don't want to get away from, I got to push. There is no evidence that John Taylor shot the weapon that struck Hiram or Joseph. There is zero evidence of that.
Okay, that's true. That's true. I don't have that physical evidence.
Okay.
Right.
So you are accusing a man of murder with no evidence.
So I'm accusing him based on he had a shot, or there was a shot in Hiram that there was no way that they could have misremembered. Therefore, they would have had to lie about it. And then I'm accusing him based on Joseph had 3 shots left and Hiram had 1 shot, and Taylor ends up with 4 shots. That adds, the main gist of my theory is the 1 shot. But once I started trying to figure that out, man, once I figured out John was not shot 5 times. He wasn't shot in the watch. He was shot 4 times. And that's exactly the number of balls those 2 had. That's when I started adding it all together. So
again, you're inserting evidence that isn't there, and you're dismissing evidence that you don't like. Like the evidence that there was 35 other musket balls in the room counted by Joseph's attorney.
Okay. You just said that the 35 musket balls has never been physically proven. That was an eyewitness account. There was many other eyewitness account. That was his attorney that went in whenever he went in. There's many other people that went into that room. No one said 35 holes in the wall. No one.
But they said there were a lot of bullet holes. They didn't count them specifically. They didn't enumerate them.
The only actual evidence is Piercy's with the bullet holes on the wrong side of the room.
Which was a picture, like it was not a forensic sketch artist, you know?
Okay, so what's stronger proof, his picture or Joseph's attorney account of it? What's stronger evidence of those bullet holes? I mean,
he was there and he specifically counted them.
So why wouldn't Piercy have done the same thing? Why wouldn't anyone else have?
Piercy was much longer after the fact, wasn't it?
Because earlier you said, Catherine, you have to discount her testimony because many people were there and no one else gave the same story she did. So there was way more people that walked through Carthage that could have said something about number of bullet holes. And the difference
was like John Taylor was shot when he was in the room, so he probably wasn't spending his mental energy counting bullet holes in the walls and in the floor and the ceiling. Right. Willard Richards was not paying attention. He was not trained. A lawyer is going to be collecting evidence, so it is expected. It is very reasonable that
the 12 went there a year later to go answer for the city council went to answer for their charges. The court wasn't on time, so they went and visited Carthage. They made a note of the room. I think they mentioned the blood on the floor. I can't remember that. And they didn't mention anything about number of bullet holes. Why not? Why was Joseph's attorney, so specific on that? And these guys, especially
because that's his job. Like that's his job. He was the attorney. He was charged with the legal protection of his client.
So Catherine Smith's job is to protect her brother. So of course her ears are going to hear him say that. Other people might dismiss and say, I don't know what he means. And she knew exactly what he meant. So again, if you want to use those eyewitness accounts, for me, I want physical evidence. I wanted, when that room was redone in the early 1900s, they specifically mentioned when they pull the plaster down, there's no holes in the lathe behind the plaster. There's no balls on the wall or anything like that. So I'm like, crap, that would have been to me huge, but they don't mention anything like that. So there's another group out of Texas that claimed they did a laser scan.
That's the first remodel we have record of, but that was decades after the fact.
What I'm saying is if they had balls come out, then I'd be okay. That's the kind of evidence I'm looking for.
But that's unrealistic. That's unreasonable. That's improbable. Like that is not how you do it.
Okay, so let me keep asking you then. So you believe there was 35 bullet holes in the walls?
That is what was documented by a trained attorney.
And you believe that there was another 10 to 12 wounds in the other 3 guys, correct?
Total, yeah.
And how many of those were from the door?
Again, modern trauma surgeons are recommended against speculating, identifying them as entrance or exit wounds. And frankly,
okay, so when he's running to the window, if he gets shot in the back, you can assume that was from the door, right? Joseph,
yes.
Okay, so he had 2 shots in the back running to the window. So that's at least just 35 plus 2. Hiram had how many shots? But you're saying, I guess
If it's
the face shot happened in the room from the door.
if
There's
it
another
that
shot.
would be four
And then you
shots.
have Taylor's while he's on the floor going under the bed, he has 4 shots.
Hmm.
So 8 shots plus the 35. So you're saying 42 shots from the door.
Not necessarily all from the door. Could have been coming from outside.
Okay, so let's say 30 shots. Let's say 25. I don't care.
It
Whatever you want
doesn't
to say.
matter. Like that's immaterial. None
It's
of this
not,
proves
because if you go look
none
at
of this
that,
is evidence that John Taylor pulled the trigger. None of
if
this is
you-
evidence that John Taylor was the murderer.
okay, so the reason why that I said that John Taylor, that became my theory in this movie, is because, again, he had to have been lying in his account to describe this shot. This is the most probable shot. And if he was lying, then why was he lying? One good reason is that Hiram commits suicide. And that makes perfect sense why they would try to cover that up.
I read John Taylor's account. What are you saying that John Taylor's account said? That this is the most probable shot? Like, explain that.
No, John Taylor, I'm not saying that. I'm saying if this was the shot, which I believe it was, I believe that's what the evidence shows, then John Taylor had to have been lying and Willard Richards had to have been lying about their their eyewitness accounts. What they described is so far off of that. Why were they so wrong? And is it they just misremembered? And when you run through all the scenarios,
Or they didn't, or they weren't, or they didn't see it. And they're just piecing together after it happened, and they look back, and then after the dust has settled and the mob has dispersed, they can kind of try to piece it together.
We can run through that scenario. If they didn't see it, that means the mob made that shot, correct? Obviously. If the mob shot him through here and it exited here, how did they make that shot?
The only evidence that this is an entrance wound is the coroner's report identifying this. But as
and
I've
the skull and the face mask. So
okay, the face mask. Let's get one thing real quick. So the face mask is not evidence because it's been tampered with. So like by definition, it is not admissible. We shouldn't be using the face mask as evidence here. It's useful from a historical perspective, like to have kind of a reminiscence of what their face may have looked like, but that really does not have bearing in the murder investigation that you're attempting to pin on.
The reason why I like the face mask is because a lot of people think that wound was to the side of his face, and it's not. It's on the side of his nose. If you go look sideways on the death mask captured that. Correct. So that's why I think that's a valuable piece of evidence. Secondly is the size of that hole. The Lyon brothers somehow claim to have measured it at 0.69 inches. So is that an important detail or not?
Okay, it's again, the death mask is not evidence. If they measured the hole on the death mask and it came up with 0.69 inches, that's fine, but that doesn't prove that it was a 0.69 caliber ball that struck him. Because we know for one thing, the hole, Sam Weston went and tried to put a 0.69 ball through the hole. It didn't fit. Yeah. So we know for a fact that it was a much smaller, probably 0.52 caliber. That was a period musket caliber, and that's what the hole measures. But when it penetrates, when it goes through, it could have widened. It could have, been deformed slightly and caused us a larger entrance wound. So I'm not saying that that's impossible, that this was a 0.69 entrance bullet wound, but to definitively say, oh, that was a 0.69 musket ball is provably false. So the Lions were just off on that. Okay, good. So again, I think we both agree that there was one shot. That your theory had one shot, correct? I mean, we don't know, but that's the best I've come up with so far. Yeah. And the eyewitnesses say there was 2 shots. So why do you disagree with the eyewitnesses on that? Because the eyewitnesses were basing that assumption off the coroner's report. I do not believe the eyewitnesses were staring at the corpse of Hiram and saw the bullet strike them. What made you convinced it was one shot? Because recreating the fact that this shot would not have killed him. This was not what caused him to bleed out. This was not the kill shot.
What convinced you that it was one shot rather than two?
Because honestly, the grazing, the bullet holes that grazed his clothing was helpful.
So a few seconds ago, you said there's no evidence of that. There's no evidence of that there's one shot. And I'm like, yeah, there is. Let's talk through the evidence. You're like,
there's no evidence that there's no evidence that this was the entrance of a single shot. But again, I can't prove that it was one shot either.
Okay, but you were convinced that it was. What I'm saying is when you go through the evidence, you get convinced of one way or another. You were convinced that the eyewitness's account is wrong and that it was one shot. And guess what? Most people not saying,
I don't know how I have to keep saying this. The eyewitnesses, yes, that's what they put in their account, but it doesn't mean that they were staring at his corpse and saw the second bullet strike him.
Agree. I'm only making the point
the coroner
were convinced for a reason, and I was convinced for a reason that it's one shot. We were both convinced for reasons, and we're both putting forth our evidence for why. You keep saying you have no evidence, and I'm like, yeah, I do. I don't interpret it the same way as you do, obviously. But that's why we both are. Are you there?
You can't. Are you
there?
Oh, are you there?
There you are.
Okay, I must have had an internet glitch or something. So do you need forensic evidence to know that something happened?
Okay, tell me that again. Ask me that again.
Do you feel that you need forensic evidence to know whether something happened?
For example, could I just come up with knowing what happened from just an eyewitness account? Is that what you mean?
I mean, sure. That's one example. Yeah.
I would say that all of it helps getting closer to the truth.
Okay. So what forensic evidence do you have of the first vision? You believe the first vision happened, I presume.
I don't have any forensic evidence of that.
So do you believe it happened?
Actually, I guess there is a grove. He did live. We know where he lived. There was a grove there. That matches his testimony. There was a grove. And there is burn marks on those trees. I'm just kidding. There's not. No, there's no other forensic evidence than that.
Okay. So is it impossible to know that the first vision happened?
Based on forensic evidence, yes. It's impossible to know that.
Okay. Is it impossible to know that Jesus did the atonement without forensic evidence?
Wait, it is. Oh, I misunderstood your question.
Okay.
Yes, it is possible to know that Joseph saw the first vision without forensic evidence. Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't understand what you're saying. Sorry.
Okay. Okay.
I thought you were asking, does forensic evidence prove? And I said, no, there is no forensic evidence that proves that.
Yeah, because there is no forensic evidence that the first vision happened.
Right.
Because forensic evidence requires a scientific approach. There is no forensic evidence that Jesus was the Messiah and did the atonement and all of that. There is none. Nevertheless, you can know that those things are true. And I think I'm just going to say there's no forensic evidence that John Taylor killed Joseph Smith or Hiram. None. And in fact, I do have a testimony that John Taylor was a man of God. He saw the Savior in the flesh. And murderers don't have that experience. Maybe they get consumed during that experience, but John Taylor survived it. So I mean, I understand that
King David.
So King David did not enter into the presence of the Lord.
How do you know that? Was he not one of the Lord's chosen and anointed?
Yeah, but there's no record of it. So are we inventing historical evidence, scriptures that don't exist too?
All right, Taylor. Okay.
I'm sincerely like.
All right, keep going with your testimony, epistemology. That was interesting. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, my name is Taylor. I'm not related to John Taylor by blood. but I was named after him. And so I've always kind of felt an affinity, like a bond, a kinship to him as a person, but I never really knew much about him. I mean, he's kind of a forgotten president in a lot of ways, in LDS, in modern culture, in the church. And so, like, I grew up just assuming he was a good guy, but didn't really hardly know him, didn't know anything about him, didn't read his teachings much. Uh, when I got home from my mission, I came across a sermon that he preached, and I was just overcome by the Spirit, because he was preaching on constitutional principles. He was speaking about freedom and principles of liberty, and
Mhm.
and it just really stirred my spirit. And I was like, dang, I never knew how cool John Taylor was. So since that time, I've actually taken an interest into him. Well, then I was doing some personal studies, and came across some historical evidence that John Taylor, when he was on the underground, had an amazing experience where he was visited by Joseph, in the flesh, and also he was visited by the Savior.
Joseph
And
in the flesh, what do you mean?
yeah, Joseph
Joseph
Smith.
in the flesh?
Yeah. And so, yeah, Joseph came and visited him, counseled with him over the course of a night. It was
Did
September
Joseph had
20.
a body? Is that what you just said?
It's possible that's what it meant. I mean, John Taylor was in the flesh. Joseph visited him. Whether that means Joseph was resurrected or not, I don't know. Now, the remains of his mortal husk could have still been in the ground, because I mean, Jesus, yes, his body that was put in the tomb was the same body that he took up and was resurrected in. But it's possible that the scriptures do not say that you have to have the same molecules, because our molecules, our body, all of the atoms recycle every 7 years. Like, that's kind of just an accepted medical health, biological fact. So, well, which point of our body, like, is it the point of the body that when you die, those are the molecules and the elements that are going to be resurrected? Well, then what happens when the worms eat it? When what if you get bitten by a wolf, and and your flesh is torn asunder? And so, to me, it doesn't, just because there was bones and remains that were found in the burial sites of Joseph and Hiram's graves, doesn't mean that they're not resurrected. Maybe they aren't. Maybe they are. I don't know. I've never met them in a resurrected state, so I can't really say with firsthand knowledge. I'm open to the possibility that they are resurrected. So, regardless, John testified that he, in the flesh, met Joseph, counseled with him all night, September 26th, 1886, through September, the morning of the 27th. And that also the Savior visited him that evening, gave him instruction. And I had never heard this account. Like, this is an amazing account, and it was kind of like shocking. It was like, kind of faith promoting. And in the moments, like, dang, you hear about that stuff in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s with Joseph a little bit, but this is 1886. It felt a lot closer, in I guess you could say. And I was like really intrigued. But then one day I was just sitting in gospel doctrine class, um, and kind of just, there was a new teacher. I wasn't really kind of in the zone, you might say. I was just kind of pondering on this, and out of nowhere, I received a an immense spiritual outpouring that just almost to the consuming of my flesh. It felt like electricity was coursing through me. It was a very powerful experience. And the Lord gave my heart a testimony that this experience John Taylor had was true, and that the revelation that he recorded on the 27th, 1886 revelation, was a true revelation of God. And it was the same type of experience by which I gained my testimony of the first vision, the Book of Mormon, and that the atonement, the atonement of Jesus Christ. And so I can testify that John Taylor was a man of God. I have a testimony. I don't have forensic evidence. I don't have any of that, but I do have the witness that the Holy Spirit has given me. And it's the same Spirit that has given me the witness of Christ, the atonement, and the restoration. So yes, I came into this with a bias of, I believe John Taylor's a good man. But I was willing to consider the possibility that I had misinterpreted that experience, that I had maybe it was from question the source of that experience for a moment. I was willing to, if there was new information that's available, I was willing to investigate. And so as I investigated, I continually came up against the fact that there is no evidence that John Taylor was the murderer. And that is why I am more sure today than I was even before this whole Carthage conspiracy thing became, I became aware of the Carthage conspiracy. I am more certain today that John Taylor did not kill Joseph than ever.
Great, man. I think that's awesome. I love your journey. I love your experience. Um,
And it's a little random because like most members of the church don't have a specific experience of like an outpouring of the Spirit. I mean, we try as missionaries, we try to guide people to have that experience about Joseph and about the Book of Mormon, and it's kind of rare to find somebody with John
there
Taylor.
is many people that have testified similar. And like for me, if you came and said Joseph did some horrible something, I'd be just like that. I'd be like, no, he didn't. And I will approach everything as he didn't. Or if you
But
tried to disprove the Book of Mormon, I'd be like, no, it's true. I wouldn't be, most people would just be like, it's not true, forget it, you're an idiot. But I would actually look through your claim, if that makes sense, which is what I like about you, is you considered it. I'm like, I love that, dude. I
yeah,
love so
and
many
if there
things.
had been evidence, I would have been open to it.
Now you say there is no evidence, but you say it in the same way as there's no evidence that the mob killed him. And there's not. There's a bunch of eyewitness accounts. So I'm like, okay, there is evidence. What does the evidence say? We disagree on, and I'm okay with that. But to say there's no evidence, I'm like, come on, man, I don't think that's a fair statement to make. But I'm totally fine with saying, you think I'm up in the night and I'm just trying to wreck John Taylor, and that's why I'm getting all the evidence wrong. I'm totally fine with that. But you're keep repeating there is no evidence. That's not true. There's plenty of evidence.
There is circumstantial evidence with you, which if you choose to interpret it in a very specific way, which to me is totally arbitrary and not supported by the full context, then you can make that claim.
Again, by your claim, there's no evidence that they didn't do it. So there's some sort of, that's one of the logical fallacies, whatever. Just saying that doesn't prove that both isn't a possibility. So I'm like,
but again,
anybody anywhere.
Like, okay, but forensics has a specific meaning. It's like DNA, fingerprints,
Yes.
powder burns. Like
Yes.
there is no evidence that Joseph didn't kill Hiram,
Well,
and so why didn't you
there's
take that
evidence
approach?
that Joseph shot John Taylor 3 times. There's evidence that Hiram shot him once. That's very strong evidence. So how do you interpret why they would do that? For me, when you add that together with the evidence of the one shot, that the eyewitnesses had to have been lying about the one shot. That's why I'm like, there's plenty of evidence, but it's not 100%. But there's enough that if we made our cases to the public, which we're doing, that they can decide either way. And I love that you argue your position so strong. I love what you're doing. I love it. Now, I've had so many people approach me about their spiritual witnesses. There are a ton of people out there that saw visions, and they are just as spiritual as you, as the way you described in the first vision, Joe, and they've had visions of what happened in Carthage. And they came and described them to me. And I had to decide, would I include that in the movie or not? And in the end, I didn't, because I didn't think that's not evidence. It has to be physical evidence is what this movie is about. But then after the movie came out, even more people reached out. They're like, it's unbelievable how you got this right. It is unbelievable. I saw exactly what you just described 10 years ago. I've written it down. I've told people I can, and I'm like, that's great. Do I take their visions as evidence of my theory? No, I've never used that before. I've never brought that up in any of these discussions, but you just went spiritual, and I'm like, okay, there's another side of that. There's other spiritual witnesses to it that are exact opposite.
But there's a difference between a positive spiritual witness and a negative, an accusation given spiritually. And ironically, I came across this article that Joseph Smith published in the Times and Seasons recently. And, so it says this, it's from April 1st, 1842, Times and Seasons. quote, "No person through the discerning of spirits can bring a charge against another. They must be proven guilty by positive evidence or they stand clear." So the fact that these people are claiming spiritual like visions or whatever to accuse
Tell
John,
me that quote. Who said that? I hadn't
uh,
heard that before. That was
Joseph Smith.
interesting.
So it's Times and Seasons. It's called Try the Spirits. This is a quick, I'll just put it in the chat to be honest. Like, let's do this here.
That's super interesting.
Yeah, so there we go. So no person through the discerning of spirits can bring a charge against another. They must be proven guilty by positive evidence or they stand clear. So that's the standard that Joseph set.
Okay, so since can bring a charge against another, they must. Is that charge go both ways? Like, can you say, I had a spiritual witness that this man is innocent? If someone
Well,
was
that would
brought
be the
forth on
opposite of a charge. That would be a defense.
that's what I'm. So Joseph would be okay with that if someone stepped forward and said, "The Spirit told me he's innocent," and then Joseph would include that as evidence.
I'm not necessarily saying it would be admissible in like a murder court case or something
I'm
like
talking
that.
about Joseph. Would he say, "Okay, well, if you had a positive experience, then it must be true"? You think Joseph would do that? Because I read that as, I don't know, man. I've
So
never seen that quote.
what he's saying
I
is,
need a second to look at that one. I haven't never seen
okay,
it before.
okay. So positive experience is different from positive evidence. I mean, Joseph had character flaws, or he had lack of discernment in certain people's characters. I mean, John C. Bennett being a great example. He thought that he was his friend, that's a guy that he could trust. Turned out he's a scoundrel, and he defrauded Joseph and a lot of people in the church. So, but Joseph's charges against him was that was not based off of a spiritual experience that somebody claimed that I saw a vision and John C. Bennett was a bad guy. Like
Right.
those kinds of charges are not admissible. Like you would need positive
So
evidence.
I didn't bring any charges based on people's spiritual experiences. Are you saying your spiritual experience, because it was positive, is more real than these other people's visions that they had?
I'm saying that my testimony is not that John Taylor was innocent. My testimony is that John Taylor was a man of God. He received revelations that the Spirit has confirmed to me are of God. He had experiences. One of the few accounts that I actually trust, that he had a theophany. He encountered God in the flesh. That is my testimony of John Taylor.
Got it.
And men of God
So other
do not
people
commit
who
murder.
don't believe that.
Men of God do not commit murder.
Again, King David, Moses.
Okay, he fell from his exaltation. Yeah,
Yeah,
King David
yeah.
was a man of God, but
David
after
actually
he
went
committed murder, he was no
afterwards.
longer a man of God.
After that, he was the most penitent of anyone in the scriptures. All he did was sing praises to the Lord all day, ask for forgiveness, wrote amazing scriptures. I mean, had all sorts of
And he
experiences.
still fell from his exaltation. He was
Yes,
no
and I
longer a man of
believe
God.
that if John Taylor murdered Joseph, and I think he did, same scenario, and I hope he was repentant, and I hope he can overcome that. Absolutely.
Okay. I really appreciate your time. I am just noticing, I'm hearing my baby cry out, and so I probably better go help my wife. I think, I feel like we've made our cases. We'll let the court of public opinion come to their own conclusions. I'll share the recording of this with you, and
Great.
then I am going to get around to posting these on YouTube on the channel and stuff.
Great.
And I'll include the links. Like I have a lot of stuff here in the chat that I'm going to post in the the caption of the link.
And I will go think through your theory, because again, I want to say it's excellent. It's awesome that you did that, man. I love it. And I think it's great. I think it's got some interesting, compelling new components that no one's thought of before. So it's fantastic. Well done.
Cool, cool. All right. Well, appreciate your time. I'll let you go for now. Have a great night.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks.